Okay, we're looking now at the mitzvah of Kiddush. We started last week, and we established so far that the mitzvah of Kiddush is DeOraisa, and it's derived from the pasuk Zocher es Yom HaShabbos Lekadsho. Exactly what the Torah has in mind is the subject of great controversy, and it goes from one extreme to the other. You have one shita that says that Zocher es Yom HaShabbos Lekadsho not only requires Amira B'Peh, it requires a bracha. And not only does it require bracha, it requires yayin. And the Ritva points out that that's why there's a conflict between yayin of Nazir, which is prohibited to a Nazir, and yayin shel mitzvah, which is a mitzvah DeOraisa on the night of Shabbos to be mekadesh al yayin. And then we go to the other extreme. And there are shitos, Rabbi Kivega amongst them, that to fulfill the mitzvah DeOraisa of Kiddush, all you need is to mention that it's Shabbos. You say to someone, good Shabbos, Shabbos Atava, and you yotze the mitzvah DeOraisa. In between the extremes, we have most of the Rishonim, the Rambam, the Rashba, and many other Rishonim would say that the mitzvah DeOraisa is fulfilled through Amira B'Peh. Hira Alev is not enough, but you don't need a bracha. All you need is to formulate divrei shevach v'kilus, to be mekadesh the Shabbos with words of praise, of exclaiming and proclaiming the beauty of Shabbos, the greatness of Shabbos, bo'ikala, bo'ichala. And that kilus, that praise of Shabbos, can be formulated in one's own words. Each person, lefitzachus l'shono, the way he would like to phrase it. There's no standard, no need for a bracha. You just need amira and divrei shevach. That's the middle of the shita. You don't need yayin. You don't need makom suda on a DeOraisa level. And the Magen Avraham is famous for saying, this goes back already 4.5 centuries ago, that you can be yotze Kiddush DeOraisa with tefillah, because there's a paragraph that ends the middle bracha of tefillah on Arvis of Shabbos, which describes the Shabbos and the sanctity of the Shabbos, and ends with Baruch Atah Hashem, Mekadesh HaShabbos. That itself is the kiyum of Zocher es Yom HaShabbos Lekadsho. What I'd like to look at now is a famous question of the Nod B'Yehuda. You're all familiar with it. It could be you don't know it was the Nod B'Yehuda who raised the question. And in the writings of the Nod B'Yehuda, it's very difficult to find this question, but his great Talmud, the Baal Tshuva Me'ava, which you'll find if you have the pages, which David was kind enough to send out, you should find it on page Chaf Vav in the Tshuva Me'ava, Orach Chaim Siman Reish Lamed Ches. And I want to thank publicly the Shivti organization of the Lakewood Yeshiva Beis Medrash Gavoa, because not only did they anthologize and join together so many sources, but they also were true to the original page of those sources. I happen to own the Tshuva Me'ava. I have the Baruch Hashem, the original Tshuva Me'ava, and they added pointers. So you'll see on each page, I hope you all received it. I would highly recommend that you print it out so that you have it in front of you. Page Chaf Vav. I have an old edition of this particular kuntris, and in my edition, it appears on page Chaf Gimel. But either way, it should say on top of it, Tshuva or Chaim Reish Lamed Ches Tshuva Me'ava. And he was a Talmud Muvak of the Nod Yehuda Rabbi Yechezkel Landau. He says, Afana Amina Ktsas Tam. He says that women have an obligation in Kiddush, and paradoxically, that obligation in Kiddush exceeds beyond that of a man. How could it be? And the first source in this kuntris, which you'll see on page Zion, after all the introductory pages, is a Gemara in Brachos on Daf Chaf Amid Beis, and the Gemara quotes Rav Ado Bar Ava, and he says that Noshim Chayavos B'Kiddush Dvar Torah, which means that women are obligated in the midst of Kiddush according to the Torah law. And the Gemara raises the following objection. How could it be that women are obligated in Kiddush? We have a principle that called mitzvah seishas man grama noshim pturos. And what could be more of a mitzvah seishas man grama than Kiddush to sanctify this period of time? And Abai says, no, take out the words Dvar Torah, and it means that the Rabbanan instituted an obligation of women to recite Kiddush. Rava gets up and he objects. How can you change the girsa? We have it explicitly. It says, Noshim Chayovas B'Kiddush Dvar Torah. So Rava answers the question of Mitzvah Seishas Man Groma with the famous Hekesh, Zochar v'Shamar b'Dibra, Kol sheyeshno b'Shmira, yeshno b'Schira. Women are included in Shmira, hence they're included in Zechira. And that's a DeOraisa halacha. But what does it mean to say that women have an obligation that exceeds beyond that of men? He says the following, I want to give a little bit of an insight, an explanation to this. Al pi mashra isi mashakos Mori Amanoach is already after the Gon, the Nod Yehuda, who is also the author of many other works called the Tzlach and the Dagul Mervava, after he died. Shemistapek ha'isha makadesh umotzi ishto b'nei beso. He vacillates back and forth in Nod Yehuda when a man recites Kiddush on behalf of the members of his family, including his wife. Im noshim asher lo hispalu arvis. Okay, we have Baruch Hashem today, noshim tzidkonios, and they daven Ma'ariv on Friday night. But you may know by chance one or two women out there that don't daven Ma'ariv on Friday night. And in Cain, lo kibu Shabbos v'tfilah. We have Kabbalah Shabbos by reciting Arvis, by Tfilah. They don't have that. Ha'ish kvar ispalal Arvis. However, the man already davened Ma'ariv. The Kibbutz Shabbos b'Tfilah. And the Nod Yehuda assumes that once he was Makabel Shabbos in Tfilah, Im Kain Eina Mechuyev min HaTorah, he has already discharged his obligation of Kiddush on a DeOraisa level, Zochar Yom Shabbos L'Kadsha. And as I mentioned earlier, the Magen Avram, who's a good 100 years, maybe 150 years before the Nod Yehuda, he already established, and you'll see that here on page Yud Ches in the same kuntris, that you could be Yotze Yochiv DeOraisa of Kiddush in Tfilah. The man recited Tfilah, and therefore he fulfilled his obligation. The woman, in this particular scenario, did not recite Shmon Esrei, and therefore she was not Yotze al Mitzvah of Kiddush. We've already established that a woman's Chiyuv of Kiddush is DeOraisa. Zochar v'Shomer b'Dibra Echad. And then Nod Yehuda now vacillates. Can a man who has already fulfilled his mitzvah DeOraisa be motzi a woman who has not yet fulfilled her mitzvah DeOraisa, and he says, "Ha'ish eino mechuyev min haTorah." Of course, he's obligated midrabanan to recite Kiddush because tefillah is not b'makom suda, it's not al yayin, it doesn't have a nusach of the brach of Kiddush as established by the Anshe Knesset Gedola. This was the famous kasha of the Rashba in Chuvas, which you'll see here on page Yud Zayin in your countries. And again, I encourage you to see it inside. Maybe we'll get a chance to go through it. And the Rashba says, since the Gemara says in Brachos Daf Chav that Kiddush is DeOraisa, Zocher is Yom Shas Kadsho, how could the Gemara in Brachos on Daf Lamed Gimel establish that Anshe Knesset Gedola were the ones who established the bracha and the Kiddush on Shabbos? And the Rashba says there's no contradiction. The Gemara in Brachos and Daf Chaf is talking about Zochas Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho on a DeOraisa level. And in Torah, you can be Mekayim in the midst of Zochas Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho simply by describing and praising the Shabbos, the uniqueness of Shabbos. Direi Shevach V'Kilus. When the Gemara in Brachos Daf Lamed Gimel says that it was the Anshe Knesset Gedola established Kiddush, that's referring to Kiddush DeRabanan through the specific nusach as formulated by the Anshe Knesset Gedola b'makom suda al hayayin. So we see already in the Chuvas Rashba that there are two dimensions to the mitzvah of Kiddush. There's Kiddush DeOraisa and there's Kiddush DeRabanan. The Nod B'Yehuda points out, and this already was before the Nod B'Yehuda in the writings of the Magen Avraham, that the moment you daven Ma'ariv, you've already expressed Divrei Kilus and Shevach to the Shabbos in the Shmon Esrei. Therefore, you've already fulfilled your mitzvah DeOraisa of Zochas Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho. You are still missing the mitzvah of Kiddush DeRabanan with the nusach of the bracha established by the Anshe Knesset Gedola over Yayin b'makom Suda. Your wife, on the other hand, if she didn't daven Ma'ariv, she's obligated in Kiddush DeOraisa because of the principle of Zocher V'Shomer V'Dibur Echad. Imkain asks the Nod B'Yehuda, Eich motziin b'shmiyasan min ha'ish? Can a woman fulfill her obligation by listening to the bracha of her husband when her husband is only chayev midrabanan, whereas she's chayeves midoraisa? Now you might ask the question, well, that's not an issue. Afal pisha yotza motzi, kinamrina b'Rosh Hashanah daf chavtes omid beis. We have a principle called yotza motzi, which means that even though I already fulfilled my obligation in a particular mitzvah, I can still be motzi you who are obligated in the mitzvah and have not yet fulfilled their obligation. And the underlying rule here is Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. So even though I already benched, I can still recite Birkas Hamazon for you. And even if I already recited Hallel, I can recite Hal for you. And you might argue that therefore, even if I fulfilled my mitzvah of Zochar Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho, I can still recite Kiddush for you. He says, Hainu mitam arvus, shekol Yisrael Arevim Zebezeh. Moshe Kosav Rashi Sham, he quotes a Rashi in Rosh Hashanah. Kosav Harosh b'Mesechta Brachas Daf Chaf Lamed Beis. Sheha'isha eina b'chlal arvus. What that means is that a woman does not bear responsibility for a man's obligation, meaning she is responsible for women's obligation, but not for men's obligation. Which means that a woman could be motzi another woman, but she cannot be motzi a man. Okay, but maybe it only works in one direction. Maybe there's no arvus, according to the Rosh, from a woman to a man, but from a man to a woman there is arvus. On this point, the Nod Yehuda vacillates. And he says that it makes more sense to assume that when we're saying that a woman has no arvus vis-a-vis a man, according to the Rosh, then it works in both directions. Kishem, just like a woman doesn't have arvus vis-a-vis a man doesn't have arvus vis-a-vis a woman. If, on the other hand, the man hasn't daven ma'ariv and he's obligated in Kiddush DeOraisa, then he will be a bar chiyuv on a DeRaisa level. His wife, likewise, has not daven ma'ariv and she's obligated in Kiddush DeOraisa. So then I don't have to activate the principle of Yotze Motzi. All I have to say is that both bar chiyuva and one bar chiyuva can motzi another bar chiyuva. But in a case where he already fulfilled his obligation, then the only thing that would make him into a bar chiyuva vis-a-vis his wife is arvus, because the fact that he's arev and he's responsible for his wife to discharge her duty, kol Yisrael arev muzeh. Therefore, even though he was yotze, he already fulfilled his obligation. The halacha considers it as if he hasn't yet fulfilled his obligation, because his obligation entails arvus, which means to the same extent that he has to fulfill his duty, he has to make sure that his wife fulfills her duty. That's part of his chiyuv, and that's what kol Yisrael arev muzeh. But if between a man and a woman there's no kol Yisrael arev muzeh, and it doesn't matter at all if they're married, then he is not a bar chiyuva vis-a-vis his wife. He already fulfilled his obligation in tefillah. She is obligated in DeRaisa and Kiddush, and therefore argues the Nod Yehuda that he cannot be motzi her based on the Rosh, who says in Masechet Brachos Daf Chaf that there's no arvus. And although, again, let's emphasize, the Rosh only went in one direction to say there's no arvus between a woman and a man, but the Nod Yehuda wants to take it full swing and apply it logically to its conclusion and say that kishem that she's not a reva for him, he's not ari for her. The ayin shom sheherich v'chayotze b'zekos mori agon nishmaso edem b'sifra tzlach. P.S. The tzlach was named after his mother, Tzion L'Nefesh Chaya. Not Yehuda's mother was Chaya. Reish Perek Ches de Brachos Shenoshim Ein Darkan Lispal Arvis Ube Kiddush Hayom, since a woman did not daven ma'ariv, Hein Chayavas Dvar Torah Zocher V'Shamim B'Dibur Echad Hayima Isha Mekadeshes Liatzma. If a woman wants to make Kiddush for herself, that's fine. And now the Nod Yehuda comes up with a Kiddush. Let's see if we can possibly decipher the Kiddush here of the Nod Yehuda. So far, we're on solid ground. And the problem which the Nod Yehuda presents to us is very crystal clear. He is not chayav midoraisa. The only thing that can make him a bar chiyuva vis-a-vis his wife is arvus, and he already daven ma'ariv, so he's not a bar chiyuva like his wife is. A bar chiyuva always has to be on the same level. A DeRabanan bar chiyuva cannot be motzi a gadol. Let's say, for example, a cotton can't be motzi a gadol, even if the cotton is chayav min Rabbanan, because in order to set up a din of lahotzi es chavero yidei chovasi, you need a bar chiyuva on the same level. He's already on a lower level. The only thing is you can activate the principle of Yotze Motzi, but that principle is predicated, as Rashi says, Rosh Hashanah, on arvus. And guess what? Based on the Rosh, we don't know if there really is arvus between a man and a woman. If there's no arvus for a woman vis-a-vis a man, then we should apply it logically to its conclusion. There's no arvus from a man to a woman. So in Manavshach, he can't be motzi a woman in Kiddush. So asks the Nod Yehuda. If you're going to tell me that he's a bar chiyuva like a woman, that's not so. He already daven ma'ariv, and therefore he's not yotze. And therefore he was yotze his chiyuv DeOraisa, where she is obligated DeOraisa, he's only chayav DeRabanan, and a bar chiyuv DeRabanan cannot be motzi a bar chiyuv DeOraisa. Ella, what are you going to do? You're going to activate the principle of Yotzam Motzi, meaning he was a bar chiyuv before he recited Ma'ariv. That principle of Yotzam Motzi is predicated on Kol Yisrael HaReivim Zeh B'Zeh, which we don't know would apply in this case. Says the Nod of Yehuda, an interesting Kiddush. There's a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai about the Seder HaBrachos of Kiddush. And Beis Hillel is what we're familiar with. You start with the bracha on the yayin, Bor Pri HaGofen, and then you recite the bracha of Mekadesh HaShabbos. Beis Hillel will start with the yayin, and the reason for that is because the yayin is gorem es ha-kiddush lavo. You cannot recite kiddush unless you have yayin. We'll come back to that point in just a minute. Beis Hillel offer a different alternative explanation because yayin is tadir. We recite Bor Pri HaGofen in many, many occasions, and tadir v'sheina tadir kol. Anyway, bottom line is that according to one explanation of Beis Hillel, the yayin comes first, the birchas hayayin comes first because it's gorem es hakiddush lov. Beit Shammai disagree. Beit Shammai would like to have the bracha on Gefen samuch to the shtiyas hayayin, which makes absolute sense. They reject the notion of wedging Kiddush in between Bor Pri HaGofen and the Shtiyas HaKos. Says the Nod of Yehuda, Beis Hillel would make sense according to the Anoshim, Shekvar Yotzu B'Tfilas Arvus. The principle of Beis Hillel that Bor Pri HaGofen comes first makes sense if you hold that men already fulfilled their obligation of Kiddush in Tefillah. So that means they were Makabel Shabbos, the Shabbos is there already. And if the Shabbos is there already, we can't say that the Yayin is Gorem the Shabbos. Gorem the Kiddush. If you haven't fulfilled any obligation whatsoever, like the woman, she didn't have Ma'ariv, then you could say Hayayin comes first and then comes Kiddush Sayom. But for a man, it would make sense to say that the Yayin should come last, because basically, Beit Shammai is correct. The bracha on Yayin should come samuch to the Shtiyas Hayayin. The only thing is that what's gorem the Kiddush? It's the Yayin. So this svara of Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, that the Yayin is gorem as HaKiddush, trumps the svara of Beit Shammai that we should postpone Borei Pri HaGofen until the end of Kiddush, right before the Shtiyah. And that says that Nod Yehuda makes sense if you haven't fulfilled your mitzvah DeOraisa. And then you could say, well, so why are you making Kiddush? Because you need the Kiddush al Yayin. So when the Rabbanan established Kiddush al Yayin, we can activate the principle of Hayayin Gorem Es HaKiddush Lovo and begin the process of reciting Kiddush with Borei Pri HaGofen al Yayin. And that means that according to the understanding of the Yehuda in Beis Hillel, there's going to be a difference in the Seder HaBrachos between a man and a woman in Kiddush. Beis Hillel is going to insist that a man will recite Kiddush by first beginning with Yayin, and a woman will begin her Kiddush with Kiddush, and only then go on to Yayin. Because the Kiddush is a Kiddush DeOraisa. So you begin with Kiddush DeOraisa. And that trumps the idea of Beit Shammai that we should be masmich the Borei Pri HaGofen to the Shtiyah. But if we don't have Kiddush DeOraisa because the man already fulfilled his Kiddush DeOraisa in Tefillah, then it would make sense that we start with Kiddush Hayom and we live up and adopt the principle of Beis Shammai, and we wait until the last moment to recite Bara Pri Hagafen. Comes along the Tshuva Me'ava in a very unusual move, and he disagrees with his Rebbe. Lanias daiti achrei shanoshim madlikim uvarchim lahadlik ner shel Shabbos. When a woman comes to the Kiddush table at night, she's already lit Shabbos candles. And by doing so, Bazeh Makablanis HaShabbos, she already accepted the Shabbos. And by declaring that this is Shabbos, Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbos, she has already fulfilled Chiyuv Kiddush DeOraisa, which means that the Tshuva Mi'av understood that when the Mogen Avram requires that you fulfill, or I shouldn't say requires, when he allows and recognizes that you have fulfilled your mitzvah of Kiddush DeOraisa in Tefillah, lav dafka Tefillah. It could be Adlakas Ner Shabbos. Why? Because just like in Tefillah, he recognizes the Shabbos through his Kabbalah Shabbos, so too in Adlakas Ner Shabbos, she, in this case, has accepted upon herself the Shabbos. That itself is Zochros Yom Shabbos Lekadsho. What does Lekadsho mean? To accept the Kedusha of Shabbos and declare that this is a day that's sanctified with Shabbos. She has fulfilled that obligation to DeOraisa when she lit Shabbos candles. He has fulfilled that Chiyuv DeOraisa of Zochros Yom Shabbos Lekadsho with Ma'ariv. Now they're both on the same level. He's a bar chiyuv DeRabanan to Mekadesh al Yayin. She's a bar chiyuv DeRabanan to Mekadesh al Yayin. They have both share the identical chiyuv. They both are a bar chiyuva, and now we can apply the principle of Shomei HaKahona that I can recite a bracha on your behalf if I share the same chiyuv. So we don't have to implement arvus, and we don't have to rely on the principle of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeluzeh. Forget about that. According to Noda B'Yehuda, that would not apply if she was obligated to DeOraisa. Says the Tshuva Mi'ava, she's only obligated to DeRabanan. And what was her fulfillment of Kiddush DeOraisa? That was the recitation of Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbos. And on the side, I just want to comment, we have during the winter months, during the summer months, what's called early Shabbos. You're all familiar with early Shabbos. At what point, according to the Tshuva Me'ava, you have to use this old, I don't know how to do this. Maybe it's
Bobby mute.
So we understand that according to Tshuva Me'ava, if it's Mibod Yom, it's still light out. At what point were you Makabel Shabbos? And according to the Tshuva Me'ava, Talmido Shel Noda B'Yehuda, you were Makabel Shabbos with Tefillah, with Arvis. There are those who say that once you say Mizvah Shil Yom HaShabbos, that's Kabbalah Shabbos. But according to the Tshuva Me'ava, Ma'ariv itself is Kabbalah Shabbos. For a woman, Hadlakas Ner Shabbos is Kabbalah Shabbos. But we have to understand that together with Kabbalah Shabbos, by declaring that now this time period is sanctified with Shabbos, Kiddush Shabbos, that's a fulfillment of Zochros Yom HaShabbos, Lekadsho. Even if it's only Tosefes Shabbos, but nevertheless, it's enough to generate a Kabbalah Shabbos with a Kiyum of Kiddush. And with this fantastic idea, he explains that when a woman comes to the Shabbos table and she hears her husband's Kiddush, she can be Yotzei because now she herself is already, so to speak, lowered the anchor, the bar, and from a Chiyuv Kiddush DeOraisa, reduce it down to a Kiddush DeRabanan. And why is that? Because she fulfilled her mitzvah of Kiddush DeOraisa, Zochros Yom Shabbos Lekadsho, with Ner Shabbos. But I ask you the following question. what would be if on Friday night in the summertime in this hemisphere, he would recite Kiddush before she lit Ner Shabbos. It's light out. I'm not saying she should do such a thing, because usually we say that a woman should be Makabel Shabbos no later than a man's Kabbalah Shabbos, but Hayudvar Miola, very often a woman, and I'm not blaming them, they're not ready for Shabbos. They haven't yet lit Shabbos candles. We're sitting around and he wants to make Kiddush. He already was Makabel Shabbos an hour and a half before Shabbos, and she hasn't been Makabel Shabbos yet.
How can he be Makabel her, if she Kabbalah Shabbos for her and she's going to light later? How can that be?
It's not going to work.
Right.
Because she needs a Kabbalah Shabbos. She doesn't have a Kabbalah Shabbos. He can't be Motzi in Kiddush because he was already Yotzi Kiddush DeOraisa, and there's no Arvus, and therefore he cannot be Motzi the Isha. So just make a note of it. We'll come back and talk about this separately. I just want to finish up the Tshuva Mihava, that it's not always 100% coast clear that he and she are sharing the same level of Zachar Yom Shabbos Lekacho on a DeRabanan level. We're assuming that she already was Makabel Shabbos. And he goes on and he says, Vishuv Gamhein Eina Mechuyovas Min HaTorah. And now he raises the question about Besulos. Or, I would add, Almana. Okay, in the case of Almana, she's going to have to make Kiddush for herself. But if the Almana would introduce a man or get invited, and, all right, let's assume she lit candles in her own house. In the case of a guest, it might be complicated, but let's say a Basula. All right, he doesn't have the Lubavitcher Minig that even a Basula lights Shabbos candles, because the Nod Yehuda was not a Lubavitcher by any stretch of the imagination. And he says a Basula did not recite the Bracha Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbos, and therefore we have the problem of Nod Yehuda. How could he be Motzi Har in Kiddush? He says, "Mikol makom yotzim b'mitzvah seishel zochres yom Shabbos lekacher kasher maskirin shehu shel Shabbos." Now he invokes the principle of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, which, as I pointed out to you before, you'll find Rabbi Akiva Eiger on page Yutes in your countries. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger is of the opinion that when you say Good Shabbos, you are yotzim the mitzvah Kiddush, Shabbos Tava, because you've already declared that today is Shabbos, and that's all you need. You don't need tefillah, you don't need bracha, you don't even need divrei kilus v'sheva. All you need is the nitty-gritty of a statement, today is Shabbos. Bamir is Shabbos. That's enough, according to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, to fulfill your mitzvah DeOraisa of Zachar Yom Shabbos L'Kadsha. He doesn't go as far as the Pri Megadim, which you'll see on number Chaf Aleph. Pri Megadim is wild. He says Hira Alev is enough, because whenever it says Zechira, it means Hira Alev. Only in Zachris HaMolek, there we require Peh, because it says Lo Tishkach. So the extra Lo Tishkach teaches me that Zachar as Asher Asol L'Chol HaMolek requires Zechira B'Peh. But in the case of Shabbos, argues the Pri Megadim, since we don't have Lo Tishkach, had the Torah said Zachar Yom HaShabbos and Lo Tishkach, then we would know that Zachar means Bepeh. But if we don't have that extra limud of Lo Tishkach, then the word Zachar means Belev. But Rabbi Akiva Eiger is not willing to go that far. There are many statements in Chazal, going back to Mechilt and Sifra, that indicate that Kiddush requires Amira Bepeh, despite the fact that it says Zachar. And that perhaps is derived from the word Lakacho, but let's not get into that now. But he says that even a Shabbos Tava, without a framework of bracha or tefillah, that's enough of an Amira to fulfill Lakacho, because you are recognizing that it's Shabbos. So he says that a Basula who has not yet recited the bracha, and she won't recite the bracha, Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbos, nevertheless she's maskira, she mentions that today is Shabbos. He even says it in Yiddish, Masha Omer Good Shabbos. It is very interesting to train the Basulos that they should make sure before Kiddush, if they didn't have Ma'ariv, they should say good Shabbos, because a Basula is no less obligated in Kiddush than a married woman. And therefore, HaTorah Omra Zochros Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho, Harei Zochru also. They remembered the Shabbos with a Dibur Peh by announcing good Shabbos. Now it's Shabbos. And he quotes the Magen Avram and the Rabbi Kiva Eger, who, again, the Magen Avram is talking about Tefillah. Rabbi Kiva Eger extends it to Shabbos Tava, that therefore we reduce her chiyuv after she says good Shabbos from DeOraisa to DeRabanan, and therefore Yecholim Anoshim Lo Tzion, because he's obligated in Rabbanan because of Tefillah, she's obligated in Rabbanan because of good Shabbos, and therefore Osi DeRabanan Umapik DeRabanan, that's called Shomer Ka'ona, when they both have the same level of a Bar Chiyuv Yecholim Levarach Al Yayin Ulekadesh Achar Kas. And you can start with Yayin, as we said, because Yayin, in the case of Kiddush D'Rabbanan, it has to come first. Shayayin Gorim LeKiddush Yovo, because if not for the Yayin, there's no Kiddush. You already recited Kiddush. You already was Yotzei Kiddush. The Ein Kan Makomo Mizeh Atam Hinichua Birchas Hadlokas Shabbos LeNoshim V'Shuv Hein BeKiddush Hayom D'Rabbanan. Let it be, he says. There's no need to get so nervous about the Nod of Yehuda, and we're going to have to require that every woman who comes to the Shabbos table to get Kiddush from her husband would have to first have Ma'ariv. No need, because she was Madlik Ner, and she already declared it's Shabbos. That reduces her chiyuv of Kiddush from DeOraisa to the Rabbanan on Yayin. The Yayin is now Gorem LeKiddush Yovo. She'll start with Bar Pri Hagafen, or he'll say Bar Pri Hagafen. And the reason for that is because she already fulfilled her mitzvah DeOraisa of Kiddush by declaring it Shabbos. And in the case of a Besula, she fulfills her mitzvah DeOraisa with the words, good Shabbos. All this is based on the Magen Avram and Rabbi Kiva, that Kiddush DeOraisa does not require divrei shevach v'kilus. Again, in the Magen Avram, I'm not sure about that. The Magen Avram only says that you yotzei Kiddush DeOraisa with arvis, with tefillah. In tefillah, we actually describe the sanctity of Shabbos, that God has chosen us from the nations. Let me just get a siddur for a second. Here, I'm opening up a siddur to Tfilas Arvis Shel Shabbos, and we say the following. We say that Shabbos is a day of Menucha, Ritzei b'Menuchasenu, and we say, Hanchilenu Hashem Elokeinu b'Av, God, with your love, you have bestowed upon us, Uber-Ratzon, Ava and Ratzon. Like, for example, I don't want to talk so much about Shabbos of Shmini Atzeres, but you may remember that we added the word Ava into the Tefillah because that's indicative of the great Ava that Hashem gave us, the Otzer, the great gift of Shabbos that was locked up for many thousands of years before the creation of the world. Uber Shabbos Kodshecha. Shabbos Kodshecha itself is Divrei Kiddush. Baruch Atah Hashem Makadosh Shabbos. So that when the Magen Avram says that you could be Yotzei Kiddush DeOraisa in Arvis, I'm not sure. I hate to be a skeptic that Rabbi Kiva Eger could be justified in what I call a leap of faith and saying that Shabbos Tava is enough to fulfill your mitzvah DeOraisa of Kiddush. I don't see that. As we saw in the Rashba, and it's in the Rambam as well, the mitzvah of Zocher Yom HaSkavish L'Shadcho on a DeOraisa level requires Divrei Sheva. Where's Divrei Sheva? By saying good Shabbos. He's not saying that the Shabbos is good. He's wishing someone else a good Shabbos. And therefore, Ken Zayin, that the Magen Avram L'chud and Rabbi Akiva Eiger l'chud. And by the way, if you take for a moment a peek at Rabbi Akiva Eiger, even Rabbi Akiva Eiger is not sure about it. Again, you have it on page Yud Tes. In my version, which was the original version, it's on page Yud Zayin, because the Shifti added 2 extra pages with the passage of time. And he says, Lav dafka b'tfila, ela dekol shemazkir Shabbos, v'omer Shabbos tava, gam kein yotze. To be komakom, hizkir Shabbos. Again, the word lechora in Rabbi Akiva Eiger means my first logical impulse. It doesn't mean that that's his final conclusion. But in any event, certainly he is admitting that he's going beyond the Magen Avram. He starts with the Magen Avram in Tefillah, and then he jumps ahead to Shabbos Tava. That means that the Magen Avram did not necessarily jump as far as to establish that Shabbos Tava of Haskaras HaShabbos is enough for Zochas Yom Shabbos L'Kadsha. And the conclusion of Rabbi Akiva Eiger is against the Rashba and the Rambam and many, many other Rishonim. The Sefer HaChinuch, they all say that to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush DeOraisa, you have to describe the Shabbos. It's a Yom Menucha. It's a Yom that's moved on from the days before it, the days that are after it. And the Rashba, which is very fascinating, you'll see the Rashba again on your page Yud Zayin. Here, I think it's on page Tes Zayin. And the Rambam and the Rashba writes, Kiddush Hayom Lizkar also b'knisaso ke'ein shevach v'kilus uke'ein maimar Rabbi Chanina Shaya Omer Neitzev in a Kabel Pnei Shabbos Malkasa. Interesting. When you describe Shabbos as a Malka, as a queen, that itself is Divrei Sheva. And then he says, Makales v'omer Boi Chala, referring to the Shabbos as a Kala. V'chayotzeba b'kriyas Psuke Kedusha Shabbos. When you read Psukim that describe the Kedusha Shabbos, he gives 2 examples: Kriyas vayechulu, or v'shamu b'nei Yisrael Shabbos v'chayotze b'elu. And not only that, he says, you don't even have to read Psukim. Kol echad v'echad omer kafishi is dami lo minyone shvacho v'kedushaso v'azkaras kedusha Shabbos. Doesn't require yayin, doesn't require a specific formula of a bracha that was established by the Anshe Knesset Gdola. He's talking about Ikar Mitzvahs Kiddush DeOraisa. But you need to describe the Shevach and the Kiddush of Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva Eiger is against this Rashba. And as I said before, it's not just the Rashba, it's also the Rambam. Let's take a quick look at the Rambam, which you have on page Tes. I think I also have it on page Tes. Let's see if I'm right. Yes. We're on the same page. Says the Rambam, Mitzvahs Aseh min Torah, Lekadesh es Yom HaShabbos b'dvarim. Again, emphasize the word b'dvarim. Here, our lev is not enough, despite the Pri Megadim. Shenevar Zochas Yom HaShabbos Lekadsha Klomar. Rambam is defining the mitzvah of Kiddush DeOraisa. Zochreu b'zechiras shevach v'kiddush. Shevach v'kiddush. So just to say to someone Shabbos Tava, that's not Shevach v'Kiddush. Therefore, I insist that according to the Magen Avram, you could be Yotzei Kiddush in Arvis, in Tefillah, because there you have Divrei Shevach v'Kiddush. Ratzabanu and Yom Ava, and he gave us this great gift, and Yom Menuchaseinu and Chilanu is Yom HaShabbos, etc., etc. And you finish that bracha with Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbos. But not enough to say today is Shabbos. Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbos. But this tshuva mi'ava is predicated on the premise of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and therefore he's willing to assume that you could be Yotzei Kiddush DeOraisa simply by declaring it's Shabbos. Yes, the Shabbos. Like they say about the Brisker Rav, that when he was on his way from Brisk to settle in Yerushalayim, so on his way, he went through Turkey. It was a long, long trip. And the train was pulling out, and he looked at his watch, and he determined that it's already Shabbos. So he took everything in his pockets, threw it up in the air, and he said, Bamir Shabbos, including his passport. So I'm not suggesting that we all be briskets, but if he said Bamir Shabbos, according to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, he was Yotzei the mitzvah of Zachar Yom Shabbos L'Kadsha. And that's why Kiddush and Kabbalah Shabbos are really two sides of the same coin. As we indicated before, when you recite Kiddush of Tefillah, you're Makabel Shabbos. And if, according to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, you could be Makayim the mitzvah of Kiddush by saying Good Shabbos, or Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbos, then that itself qualifies as a Kabbalah Shabbos. Kabbalah Shabbos and Kiddush, as I said before, are two sides of a coin. They go together like what should I say, two drops of water. Joe?
Just aside from that thing, would you say that an action would be more than just a mirror? Like Kiddush is, I mean, by the Brisker of throwing stuff up, actually doing a Maisa, it would be more than just saying Good Shabbos.
Well, why is Tefillah more of a Maisa than Good Shabbos? In both cases, it's both. I'm not sure I'm following your logic.
Often we put more emphasis on something when it's done, when something's done.
I agree with you. I have no question that Maisa and Tefillah are different. But what are you comparing now? You comparing Good Shabbos to what? To Tefillah?
No, I'm saying that his action would not just be like saying Good Shabbos, because he did an action. So maybe that in itself,
what action?
Doing an action,
what action are you talking about?
Taking all of his stuff and throwing it up in the air, whatever.
That's what you meant when he threw his passport up in the air.
Yeah, I'm just saying he did an action besides just a mirror. That maybe a mirror is stronger.
Right. All right. So now, Rabos, I want to learn with you a Chassam Sofer. You should have it on page Chaf He in your booklet. In my booklet, it's on page Chaf Beis. The only problem is that this kuntres is sometimes the print gets very, very small. I just want to say one pasuk from Tehillim. That's when I hear the plane going over, because I know it's on its way to Gaza. Let me just see if I could find my magnifying glass. Oh, here it is. So again, it could be in your edition, it's a little bit larger in print. In mine, it's very, very small, literally tiny. And it's in what's called Otzer Mefarshim. So this is a very advanced publication of the Shulchan Aruch that has Otzer HaMefarshim on the page, printed on the page. He says the following: Ayin Pirush Rashi Shvuas Daf Yud Gimel B'Tos V'Sham excuse me. And he says, Mashma Dil Rashi Kiddush Yom HaKippurim DeOraisa Kimo Shabbos. He's medayik in a Rashi in Shvuas Daf Yud Gimel that Kiddush on Yom Kippur is DeOraisa. Now again, we're not going to go into the nuances of how the Chassam Sofer saw this in Rashi. Maybe we'll do that another time. But let's grant the Chassam Sofer his conclusion to be correct, that Rashi maintains that Kiddush on Yom Kippurim is DeOraisa. That's a tremendous Kiddush, because Kiddush on Yontif is DeRabanan. The Torah says, Zochres Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsho. And basically, according to Rashi, the way the Chassam Sofer understands it, Yom Kippurim has the status of Shabbos. And we'll see why. My Rebbe used to tell us that in Lita, where he was born, there were two minhagim on Yom Kippur. There were those who wished each other good Shabbos and those who wished each other good Yontif. Today, I think the prominent minhag is to say good Yontif on Yom Kippur, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But back in Lita, there were those who would say good Shabbos. They didn't say good, they couldn't pronounce the shin, so they would say good Shabbos on Yom Kippur. And you know that on a Yontif, we only have 5 kruim. On Shabbos, we have 7. On Yom Kippur, we have 6. So Yom Kippur is somewhere midway. It's a chi of kares and not a chi of lav. It's not as far as a chi of skila of Shabbos. It's somewhere in the middle, floating, as it were, between Shabbos and Yom Kippur. And now he approaches Rashi and he says, as far as Kiddush, in contrast to any other Yontif, Yom Kippurim has Kiddush DeOraisa. Kiddush DeOraisa. By the way, even before I move from the spot, I already know that Kiddush al Yayin is DeRabanan. Why? Because on Yom Kippur we don't drink wine. So therefore, if Kiddush is DeOraisa on Yom Kippur, it's got to be without wine. So far, so good. And we mentioned that the Ritva, based on a Gemara Nazir, came to the conclusion that Kiddush al Yain is DeOraisa. This Rashi, the way that Chassam Sofer understands it, that Kiddush on Yom Kippur is DeOraisa, could not in any way be squared off with the sheet of the Ritva. And it's not just the Ritva, there may be other Rishonim who might say that Kiddush al Yain is DeOraisa. Again, if you hold that Kiddush al Yain is DeOraisa, you have to know where did the Torah obligate me to recite Kiddush al Yain? It just says Zochres Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho. It doesn't say al Yain. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sure. If you can't do it, you can't do it.
I'm in Canada now. I so apologize. I'm sorry. Yeah. I always forget to do that. Yeah. I'm sorry.
It's sure. Why would you say it can't be DeOraisa? It's sure you can do it on wine.
Excellent, okay. Joe. You're a step ahead of me. Okay, hold on to this, but let's go through the Chassam Sofer and we'll come back to your point. Very good point. So what does the Chassam Sofer say? He says the following. V'taimo. Why should Kiddush on Yom Kippur be DeOraisa? Nirali. Chassam Sofer has his own insight. He says, the Shabbos v'Yom Kippurim di'ein layochid bohem shum kuvaseh rak shvos. In the case of Yom Kippur, it's Shvos me'achila u'melacha. And in the case of Shabbos, it's Shvos me'melacha. So again, he's assuming that v'samachtu b'chagecha, on Yontif you have a mitzvah of kum v'aseh to eat a se'ud of Yontif. And on Shabbos, we have to eat a Suda because of what mitzvah? Oneg. Oneg is derived from Yeshayahu HaNavi. So it's not DeOraisa, it's Divrei Kabbalah. Again, we're skipping a million steps over here. But apparently the Chassam Sofer is assuming that there's no Chiv DeOraisa of Kum V'aseh to eat a Suda on Shabbos like there is on Yontif. There's only a mitzvah of Oneg, which is not DeOraisa. It's not exactly DeRabanan. It's what we call Divrei Kabbalah. Again, that's a 10-hour discussion unto itself. But his premise is that the kumvaseh of achila applies only to Yontif and not to Shabbos. So the Torah has no kumvaseh. Shabbos on a DeOraisa level is shevi altasa, meaning himanut mi malacha, meaning that you have to abstain from doing malach. And on Yom Kippurim, it's obvious that there's no kumvaseh of achila because there's no achila on Yom Kippur. And so what's this all about? He says, therefore, eno nikar shehu l'shem mitzvah. What the Torah wanted on Shabbos, what the Torah wanted through Kiddush is that we find a way of declaring, or shall we say, proclaiming and making it obvious that this day is different. In the case of Yontif, I don't have to recite Kiddush for that. It's a Yom Nikar. What makes it Nikar? The fact that I eat a Suda. Again, it has to be a Suda al Pidin, not just the fact that I'm eating. And the Suda al Pidin on a DeOraisa level only applies to Yontif because B'samachta, which at the time of the Mikdash they fulfilled through eating Kodshim. And on Shabbos and Yontif, where is the Nikar? Because the Suda is only DeRabanan, or shall we say be Divrei Kabbalah to be more precise, but not DeOraisa. And therefore, that's what Kiddush, that's the function and the agenda of Kiddush, a fantastic Kiddush of the Chassam Sofer. I mean, if you ask me, he's coming from nowhere, like, out of left field. And again, he goes on and he says, Im eno zochreu b'knisaso, then it's not Nikah. So you want to begin Shabbos, and for that matter Yom Kippur, by reciting Kiddush, which is called Zochreu. In Yontif, I don't need that. I can fulfill Zochreu through the Suda of Yontif B'kum Vaseh. Uke'ein zeh mitam zeh tiknu b'tainis lekabel tainis miba'od yom. Dilav hachi leka el shevi altaseh. Fine, he goes on and on. So I want to think out loud with you about the following question. The Ritva says that Kiddush al Yayin is DeOraisa. Is there any way of reconciling that sheet of the Ritva with this sheet of the Chassam Sofer, based on Rashi and Shvuas, that Kiddush on Yom Kippur is DeOraisa? L'chor, it's impossible. They're mutually exclusive. Because if you require Yayin, clearly on Yom Kippur, you don't have a possibility of Yayin. Comes along Joe, and what does Joe say?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yefsha, meaning on Yom Kippur, it's impossible to drink Yayin. The Torah allowed you to fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush, the Amira, without Yayin. On Shabbos, on the other hand, where there's a possibility of fulfilling the mitzvah of Kiddush al Yayin, you required Yayin, and you're not Yotzi without Yayin. That would be the sheet of the Ritva, assuming that the Ritva would accept this radical breakthrough of the Chassam Sofer based on Rashi, that Kiddush on Yom Kippur is DeOraisa. But I have a different question, and tell me if what I'm thinking is crazy. You be my jury. I don't know. This bothers me a lot. As you and I know, very often, it's quite common that Yom Kippur coincides with Shabbos. So imagine it's both Shabbos and Yom Kippur. This year, it was not. I don't think next year either. But it's quite common. So now, according to the Ritva, I have a mitzvah of Kiddush DeOraisa, and with the Chassam Sofer, I have a double mitzvah of Kiddush DeOraisa, Hain for Shabbos and Hain for Yom Kippur. Now, obviously, I can't drink wine because it's Yom Kippur. But on a level of Shabbos, according to the Tva, I'm chayav in Kiddush al Yayin DeOraisa. Again, can we apply the principle lo efsha? Because now it becomes very strange. The mitzvah of Kiddush on Yom Kippur is lo efshar because every single Yom Kippur it's lo efshar. But on the other hand, Shabbos, by definition, in its own nature, is efshar. Are we going to say that if, let me use the word, there's a coincidence of Shabbos and Yom Kippur, now we can apply the principle of lo efshar? And we're going to say that now the Kiddush on Shabbos can be fulfilled without yayin because it's lo efshar? That I find very strange. Lo efshar is something that defines the nature of the mitzvah and its scope. The requirement of Yom Kippur as far as Kiddush DeOraisa, according to this Ksam Sofer, is by definition lo efshar. Shabbos, on the other hand, requires yayin, and that's efshar. Are we going to say now that when there's an overlap, a coincidence of Shabbos and Yom Kippur becomes lo efshar, and the mitzvah of Kiddush DeOraisa of Shabbos, Zochas Yom Shabbos L'Kadsho, is fulfilled without drinking yayin? And then when I thought about this, yeah, David, go ahead.
I was going to say, a similar question by somebody who's a Nazir. He can't be Kiddush any Shabbos.
So what happens to a Nazir?
Yeah, it'll be the same question.
Yeah, are we going to say that in the case of a Nazir, he can fulfill his mitzvah of Kiddush on Friday night without yayin? If that be the case, why does the Gemara postulate in Masechet Nazir that I have a head-on collision between the Isur Lav of yayin to a Nazir and the mitzvah Bekum Vaseh of yayin shel Kiddush, which according to the Tva is DeOraisa? And that's why there's a head-on collision, but why not apply the principle of lo efshar and say, yes, he can fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush and observe the Isur of Shtiyas Yayin to a Nazir, b'vasachas, and there's no stira. It's efshar l'kayim shneim. Why? Because in this case, for a Nazir, it's lo efshar. But you know what? On this level, I really have to get into what I call gavra chefza. It's really, this is a brisker sugya, because yayin to a Nazir is an Isur chefza.
Right. Why
do I say that? Because
what's the nature of neder?
It's a neder. And every neder, the Gemara says at the beginning of Masechet Nedarim, Daf Beis Amid Beis, is ka'asar chefza aleh. So he takes yayin, this Nazir, and he says, this is a chefza of neder, of Isur, for me. Whereas the mitzvah of Shtiyas Yayin in Kiddush, even if I grant you it's DeOraisa, that's a Chovas Gavra. So the very fact that the Gemara postulates a contradiction between Nazir and Kiddush on Shabbos is very problematic for me. I don't understand it. Because I would say clearly that you cannot fulfill your Chovas Gavra. Let's say you had Yayin Shel Tevel. Could you fulfill your mitzvah DeOraisa according to the mitzvah of Yayin Shel Kiddush with Yayin Shel Tevel? And I can give you many other examples. For a Nazir, Yayin is Tevel. It's a Chefetz D'Isura. Like, for example, if a person takes a neder sukkah zu as asura lai, he will not sit in that sukkah on Leil Sukkos. Or if a man says matzah zu asura lai, he's mushpa v'yomed me'ar Sinai.
Yeah, but
and therefore the neder shouldn't be chal. The answer is no. The neder is chal on the chefza of the matzah,
right? And
the mushpa v'yomed is on the gavra, and the gavra can only use matzah muteres, matzah de'tera, not matzah d'isura. Okay, this is already way beyond the parameters.
What does the Ritva say about challah? About making Kiddush on challah? That's not that's DeRabanan, or like what is it?
Excellent question, Bobby, which we have to pick up under a separate topic. There's going to be another kuntris from Lakewood Yeshiva about the two alternatives for Kiddush, Pas and Yayin. And l'chora, according to the Ritva, if you assume that Kiddush DeOraisa requires Yayin, hence there was a conflict between Nazir and Kiddush, then how does Pas become a substitute, an alternative for Yayin? So that's already more advanced than what we're up to now. Okay, then, so we're finished pretty much for today. I want to thank you.
Thank you.
I also want to suggest, or I don't know,